What happens when a country music superstar walks onto a late-night set expecting a friendly conversation, only to find himself ambushed with questions that cross every line imaginable? What we witnessed unfold between Blake Shelton and Jimmy Fallon wasn't just uncomfortable television. It was a complete meltdown that nobody saw coming. The tension, the accusations, the moment Blake finally snapped, all of it happened live in front of millions of viewers. Before we get into exactly what sent Blake over the edge, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us whose side you're on in this whole situation, because trust me, you're going to have strong opinions by the end of this. The Tonight Show set was buzzing with its usual energy as Blake Shelton walked out to thunderous applause. He waved to the crowd, that signature grin plastered across his face as he settled into the guest chair across from Jimmy Fallon. The audience was electric, fans were cheering, and everything seemed perfectly normal for the first few minutes. Jimmy opened with his typical softball questions, asking about Blake's latest album, his tour dates, the usual promotional circuit conversation that guests expect when they sign up for these appearances. Blake was relaxed, leaning back in his chair, sharing anecdotes about recording sessions and funny moments on the road. The audience laughed at all the right moments. Jimmy did his exaggerated reactions, and it looked like just another successful late-night interview. But then something shifted. Jimmy's expression changed. His tone dropped, and he leaned forward with a look that Blake clearly wasn't expecting. "So Blake, I want to ask you about something that's been making waves online," Jimmy said. And there was an edge to his voice that cut through the light-hearted atmosphere like a knife. "There's been a lot of talk, a lot of speculation really about some of your recent comments regarding other artists in the industry. People are saying, you've been throwing shade, being dismissive of newer talent. What's your response to that?" Blake's smile faltered just slightly. He shifted in his seat, clearly caught off guard by the sudden turn in conversation. "I'm sorry, what comments are you referring to exactly?" he asked, his voice still friendly, but with a hint of confusion mixed with caution. Jimmy didn't back down. Instead, he pulled out his phone, making a show of scrolling through it. "Well, there are quite a few, actually. Twitter's been on fire about it. TikTok videos breaking down your quotes. People analyzing your body language at award shows. Some are calling you bitter, saying, you can't handle that country music is evolving beyond your style." The audience went quiet. This wasn't the playful ribbing that usually characterized Jimmy's interviews. This was something else entirely, something that felt calculated and deliberately provocative. Blake's jaw tightened visibly, and he sat up straighter in his chair. "Jimmy, I have no idea what you're talking about," Blake said, his Oklahoma drawl becoming more pronounced as tension crept into his voice. "I've always supported other artists. I've literally spent years as a coach helping new talent break into this business. Where is this coming from?" Jimmy shrugged, that casual gesture, somehow making everything worse. "I'm just telling you what people are saying, Blake. Social media doesn't lie. There are compilation videos, screenshots of interviews, people connecting dots. They're saying you've had this attitude for a while now that you think you're above everyone else in Nashville." Blake laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was the kind of laugh that comes right before someone loses their patience completely. "Social media doesn't lie. Are you serious right now? Since when did you become a tabloid show, Jimmy? I came here to talk about my music, not to defend myself against anonymous internet trolls who twist everything out of context." The atmosphere in the studio had completely transformed. What started as entertainment was rapidly becoming a confrontation. Jimmy, however, wasn't letting up. If anything, he seemed to be doubling down, pushing harder. "But Blake, you can't just dismiss it all as trolls when there are legitimate journalists writing think pieces about your behavior," Jimmy pressed, his tone taking on an almost accusatory quality. "There was that moment at the awards where you walked right past another artist without acknowledging them. There was that interview where you said modern country music is losing its authenticity. Come on, you can't pretend you don't know what impression that leaves." Blake's face was turning red now, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. "That awards moment was me not seeing someone in a crowded room, not some intentional snub. And that quote about authenticity. You mean the one where I was asked directly about my opinion on the state of music? And I gave an honest answer. Since when is having an opinion the same as attacking people?" Jimmy leaned back, crossing his arms with an expression that could only be described as skeptical. "An honest opinion or an elitist one? There's a difference, Blake. A lot of people think you're stuck in the past, unwilling to accept that country music doesn't belong to your generation anymore." That was the line. That single statement was the spark that ignited everything that came after. Blake stood up from his chair so abruptly that it rolled backward, nearly toppling over. The audience gasped, a collective intake of breath that echoed through the studio. Jimmy's eyes went wide, genuine surprise flashing across his face as Blake stepped closer to the desk, separating them. "You want to talk about elitism, Jimmy?" Blake's voice was raised now, loud enough that every word carried to the back of the studio. "Let's talk about how you invited me here under the pretense of a normal interview, then ambushed me with garbage pulled from the worst corners of the internet. Let's talk about how you're sitting there acting like some moral authority when you're just repeating gossip and lies to get ratings." Jimmy raised his hands in a defensive gesture, but his face showed he was scrambling. This had clearly gone further than he anticipated. "Blake, come on. These are legitimate questions that people want answered." "I'm just legitimate questions." Blake cut him off, his voice dripping with anger and disbelief. "You haven't asked me a single legitimate question. You've accused me of being bitter, elitist, dismissive, all based on what? Screenshots and think pieces written by people who've never had a conversation with me in their lives." The studio had gone completely silent except for Blake's voice. Cameras were still rolling, capturing every second of what was becoming one of the most explosive moments in late-night television history. Jimmy tried to speak again, tried to regain control of the situation, but Blake wasn't finished. "I've been in this business for decades, Jimmy. I've seen trends come and go. I've watched the industry change in ways nobody could have predicted. And you know what I've never done? I've never pretended to be something I'm not. I've never sold out my values for clicks or views. But apparently that makes me the villain in your narrative." Jimmy finally managed to get a word in, though his usual confidence had evaporated completely. "Blake, I think you're overreacting here. This is just a conversation. We're just talking about what's out there in the public discourse. You're a public figure. People are going to have opinions." Blake pointed a finger directly at Jimmy, his expression intense. "Don't you dare try to gaslight me right now. This isn't a conversation. This is an ambush. You didn't bring me here to have a dialogue. You brought me here to put me on trial for crimes I didn't commit. And the worst part, you're hiding behind this idea that you're just asking questions. Like you're some neutral party just reporting what others are saying." The audience was completely frozen. Some people had their phones out, obviously recording what was happening. Others just sat there with their mouths open, unable to process the fact that their fun night out had turned into witnessing a full-scale meltdown on live television. Jimmy looked to his producers off camera, clearly hoping for some kind of intervention or guidance. But nobody was stopping the train wreck in progress. "Look, Blake, I didn't mean to upset you," Jimmy said, his voice taking on a placating tone that only seemed to make Blake angrier. "Maybe we got off track here. Why don't we take a quick break, reset, and come back to talk about your music like we originally planned?" Blake laughed again. That same bitter sound from before. "Oh, now you want to talk about my music after you spent 10 minutes dragging my name through the mud? After you accused me of being some bitter old man who can't handle change?" "No, Jimmy, we're not taking a break. We're going to finish this conversation right here, right now, because millions of people are watching and they deserve to hear the truth instead of whatever twisted narrative you were planning to spin." Jimmy shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly out of his depth. His show thrived on feel-good moments, silly games, and friendly banter. This was territory he wasn't equipped to handle, and it showed in every nervous gesture and stammered response. "I wasn't trying to drag your name through anything. I was bringing up topics that are being discussed widely online and in the media. That's part of my job as a host. Your job," Blake's voice rose even higher. "Your job is to entertain people, to make them laugh, to give artists a platform to promote their work. Your job is not to weaponize social media garbage against your guests. Do you understand the position you've put me in? Millions of people just watched you paint me as some villain. And now, even if I defend myself, half of them will think I'm protesting too much. You've created a no-win situation for me." Jimmy opened his mouth to respond, but Blake kept going. "The floodgate's now completely open. And you want to know what the real issue is here? It's not that people have opinions about me. I'm fine with that. I've been criticized before. I'll be criticized again. That's the nature of being in the public eye. But what you did is different. You took fragments of context, random moments, internet speculation, and you presented it as fact. You gave legitimacy to nonsense by putting it on your platform. The energy in the room was electric with tension. Jimmy's band members looked uncomfortable. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or stay silent, and the cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of this unprecedented breakdown in late-night television decorum. Jimmy tried again to regain some control, to steer things in a different direction. "Blake, I hear what you're saying. I really do. But you have to understand that in this day and age, social media is part of the conversation. When things trend, when people are talking about something en masse, it becomes news. It becomes something worth discussing." Blake shook his head, his frustration evident in every movement. "No, Jimmy, you don't get to hide behind that excuse. Just because something trends doesn't make it true. Just because 1,000 people on Twitter say something doesn't make it fact. And you, as someone with a massive platform, have a responsibility to separate signal from noise. Instead, you chose to amplify the noise and present it as signal." Jimmy looked genuinely shaken now, his face flushed. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Blake. That genuinely wasn't my intention. I thought we could have an open conversation about these topics." "An open conversation?" Blake's voice was incredulous. "You ambushed me with accusations disguised as questions. That's not a conversation. That's a trap. And you know what makes it worse? You did it with that fake concerned face like you're just some innocent messenger delivering information. But you chose which information to deliver. You chose to focus on negativity and controversy instead of anything substantive or real." The silence that followed was deafening. Jimmy looked like he wanted to be anywhere but in that chair, facing down an angry Blake Shelton, who was laying bare every manipulation and calculation that had gone into the interview strategy. Finally, Jimmy spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "What do you want me to say, Blake? I'm trying to apologize here. I'm trying to acknowledge that maybe we approached this wrong. But you're not giving me any room to make this right." Blake stepped back slightly, but his posture remained tense, his expression still angry. "What I want is for you to be honest. I want you to admit that you brought me here planning to create drama. I want you to acknowledge that you prioritized viral moments over respect for your guest. I want you to stop hiding behind this idea that you're just reporting what's out there and own the fact that you're actively participating in tearing people down for entertainment." Jimmy looked down at his desk, clearly struggling with how to respond. The audience was so quiet you could hear individual people shifting in their seats. When Jimmy looked back up, there was something different in his eyes. Maybe a hint of actual remorse, or maybe just the realization that this had spiraled completely out of his control. "You're right," Jimmy said, and those two words seemed to hang in the air. "You're right that I could have handled this differently. You're right that I should have been more thoughtful about how I frame these questions. But Blake, you have to understand the pressure we're under to create content that people want to watch to stay relevant in an increasingly competitive media landscape." Blake's expression didn't soften. If anything, he looked even more disgusted by that response. "So, you're saying you sold me out for ratings? That's your defense, Jimmy. Every single person in this industry deals with pressure. Every artist, every producer, every host faces competition and the need to stay relevant. But most of us manage to do it without sacrificing our integrity or throwing others under the bus." The words hit hard, and you could see Jimmy physically recoil from them. He tried to compose himself to find some way to salvage what was left of the interview, but it was clear that the damage was done. Blake had completely dismantled not just the questions, but the entire premise of the interview strategy, and he'd done it in front of a live audience and rolling cameras. "I think we need to just end this," Jimmy said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Clearly, this isn't working, and I don't want to make things worse." Blake nodded slowly, but he wasn't done yet. "Yeah, we should end this. But before I walk off this stage, I want everyone watching to understand something. When you see headlines tomorrow about Blake Shelton exploding on Jimmy Fallon, when you see clips taken out of context and hot takes from people who weren't here, remember what actually happened. Remember that I was brought here under false pretenses, attacked with internet gossip presented as fact. And when I defended myself, that defense will be spun as me being difficult or unable to take criticism." Jimmy looked like he wanted to respond to push back against that characterization, but he seemed to realize that anything he said would only make things worse. Blake turned slightly, addressing the audience directly now. "I want you all to think critically about what you consume," Blake said, his voice steady now, but still carrying the weight of his anger. "Don't just accept what you're told. Don't let hosts or journalists or influencers tell you who the good guys and bad guys are. Actually look at the evidence. Consider the source and make up your own minds, because what happened here tonight is exactly what's wrong with media right now. It's all about gotcha moments and manufactured controversy instead of honest dialogue. The audience seemed unsure how to react. A few people started clapping, then more joined in until there was genuine applause building in the studio. It wasn't the enthusiastic cheering from earlier. It was something more thoughtful, more considered, like people were actually processing what they'd witnessed and resonating with Blake's message about media manipulation. Jimmy looked stunned by the audience response. He'd clearly expected them to side with him, or at least to be uncomfortable with Blake's outburst. Instead, they were applauding the very person who'd just torn apart his interview strategy on live television. He tried to speak to regain some control, but his voice came out uncertain. "Blake, I appreciate your perspective, and I think there's value in what you're saying about media responsibility. But I also think you're being unfair to characterize this entire interview as some malicious setup. I ask tough questions, sure, but that's part of journalism. That's part of holding public figures accountable." Blake turned back to face Jimmy fully, and the look he gave him was withering. "Holding public figures accountable. Is that what you think you were doing, Jimmy? Accountability requires facts. It requires evidence. It requires actual wrongdoing. What you did was present speculation and gossip as if it were truth. Then acted shocked when I called you out on it. That's not journalism. That's tabloid nonsense dressed up in a suit and tie." Jimmy's face was bright red now, whether from embarrassment or anger or some combination of both. "I resent the implication that I'm running a tabloid show. The Tonight Show has standards, has integrity, has a legacy of quality programming." "Then act like it," Blake shot back immediately. "Live up to that legacy instead of chasing clicks and viral moments. You have one of the biggest platforms in entertainment. You could use it to elevate conversations, to highlight real issues, to give artists a genuine space to share their work. Instead, you chose to ambush me with internet drama. That's beneath what this show used to be." The comparison to the show's legacy seemed to hit Jimmy particularly hard. His jaw clenched, and when he spoke again, there was a defensive edge to his voice that hadn't been there before. "You know what, Blake? Maybe you're not as innocent in all this as you're pretending to be. Maybe there's truth to some of what people are saying online. Maybe you do have an attitude problem. Maybe you are dismissive of other artists. And maybe that's why these stories gained traction in the first place." The audience gasped again. If the interview had been tense before, it had now crossed into openly hostile territory. Blake's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer to Jimmy's desk, close enough that the host instinctively leaned back in his chair. "There it is," Blake said, his voice low and dangerous. "There's the real Jimmy Fallon. Behind all the fake laughs and forced enthusiasm, you're just another person willing to tear someone down when they don't play along with your games. You can't handle being challenged, so you lash out and double down on the accusations." Jimmy stood up from his chair now, matching Blake's energy. "I'm not tearing you down. I'm responding to your attacks on me and my show. You've spent the last 15 minutes telling me I'm a hack, that I have no integrity, that I'm everything wrong with media. You don't get to play the victim here, Blake." "I'm not playing victim," Blake responded, his voice rising again. "I'm pointing out facts. I came here in good faith. You betrayed that trust, and when I called you on it, you're trying to flip the script and make me the problem. That's classic manipulation, Jimmy. And everyone watching can see right through it." Jimmy pointed at Blake, his own frustration, now fully visible. "You want to talk about manipulation? You're the one who turned a simple interview into this circus. You're the one who made this about media ethics instead of just answering some questions. You're the one standing here lecturing everyone like you're above it all." Blake laughed, and this time there was something almost sad in the sound. "Simple interview. Jimmy, listen to yourself. You're still trying to pretend this was normal, that your questions were reasonable, that I'm overreacting. You can't even be honest about what happened here tonight. And that's the saddest part of all this. You had a chance to own up to it, to admit you messed up, but your ego won't let you." The two men stood there facing each other across the desk. The tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The audience didn't know where to look. The band members were frozen in place. The producers off camera were probably having panic attacks, trying to figure out how to handle this disaster. And through it all, the cameras kept rolling, capturing every second for broadcast. Jimmy took a deep breath, clearly trying to collect himself. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled but cold. "I think it's time for you to leave, Blake. This interview is over." Blake nodded slowly, a bitter smile crossing his face. "Yeah, it is over. But let me leave you with one final thought, Jimmy. When you wake up tomorrow and see the headlines, when you watch the clips circulate online, when you read the comments and reactions, ask yourself if this is really who you want to be. Ask yourself if chasing drama and controversy is worth sacrificing the respect of your guests and your audience, because you can't get that back once it's gone. With that, Blake turned and started walking toward the exit. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or stay silent, resulting in scattered, uncertain clapping that sounded awkward and uncomfortable. Jimmy stood behind his desk, looking shell-shocked, clearly unsure how to proceed. His usual quick wit and charm had completely abandoned him. But Blake wasn't quite done. He stopped halfway to the exit and turned back one more time. "And Jimmy, for what it's worth, I actually used to respect you. I used to think you were one of the good ones, someone who genuinely cared about making people happy and giving artists a fair shake. I'm sorry you felt like you had to throw that away for ratings. I really am." Those words seemed to hit harder than anything else Blake had said all night. Jimmy's expression crumbled slightly, genuine hurt flashing across his face before he quickly tried to mask it, but it was too late. The cameras had caught it. The audience had seen it. And Blake had made his final point more effectively than any extended argument could have. Blake walked off the stage to a mixture of applause and stunned silence. The moment he disappeared behind the curtain, Jimmy stood alone at his desk, looking out at an audience that no longer seemed quite so friendly or supportive. He tried to smile, tried to transition to something else, anything else, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, Jimmy turned to his band leader. Let's go to commercial." His voice was hollow, defeated, nothing like the energetic host who'd started the show just an hour earlier. The cameras cut away, but the damage was done. What was supposed to be a routine promotional appearance had turned into one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. Blake Shelton hadn't just defended himself. He'd completely dismantled the entire framework of how these celebrity interviews operate, exposing the manipulation and drama baiting that often lurks beneath the surface of seemingly friendly conversations. The fallout from that interview would be massive. Social media exploded within minutes with clips circulating everywhere, think pieces being written in real time, and people taking sides in what quickly became a cultural moment. Some praised Blake for standing up for himself and calling out media manipulation. Others criticized him for overreacting and being unable to handle tough questions. But everyone agreed on one thing. This was television history, a genuine unscripted moment in an era where everything feels calculated and controlled. What made it even more powerful was that Blake hadn't resorted to personal attacks or cheap shots. He'd focused on the substance of what was happening, on the ethics of the situation, on the broader implications of how media treats public figures. He'd been angry, yes, but his anger was justified and articulated clearly. He hadn't lost control. He'd taken control, refusing to play by rules that were designed to put him at a disadvantage. And Jimmy was left to pick up the pieces of an interview that had gone catastrophically wrong. His attempt to create a viral moment had succeeded, but not in the way he'd intended. Instead of Blake looking bad, it was Jimmy who came across as manipulative and dishonest. Instead of generating buzz for his show, he generated controversy about his methods. The whole thing had backfired spectacularly. The truth is, what happened between Blake Shelton and Jimmy Fallon represents something bigger than just two celebrities having a disagreement. It represents a growing frustration with how media operates, how public figures are treated, and how drama is manufactured for entertainment. Blake's explosion wasn't just about defending himself. It was about pushing back against a system that prioritizes controversy over truth, clicks over integrity, and viral moments over genuine human connection. That's what made this moment so compelling, so important, and so unforgettable. It was real in a world of fake, honest in a sea of manipulation, and powerful in its simplicity. Blake Shelton didn't need a script or a plan. He just needed to tell the truth. And in doing so, he created one of the most talked about moments in recent television history. If you made it this far, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because we're always breaking down the biggest moments in entertainment. And drop a comment below answering this question. Do you think Blake was justified in how he handled this situation, or did he take things too far?